Hey friends, welcome back. So in today's show, we're going to take a deeper dive into cold immersion therapy and deliberate cold exposure and talk about the gender differences. Is it safe for women to go and do deliberate cold exposure therapy? Are there any hormonal differences? And during which point in women's menstrual cycle might cold immersion therapy be a good or bad idea? There's a fascinating new paper that we're going to unpack the details of which from that I thought gave some really good insights, particularly for women that are still menstruating, as to when they might, undergo cold immersion therapy and times of their cycle that it may not be favorable. We're going to talk about that. Then we have another paper here. We're going to take a deeper dive into cold shock proteins. This is a very fascinating new mechanism by which cold immersion therapy influences your physiology and protein degradation and may even impact the ability to degrade aggregated proteins within the brain that are linked with neurocognitive disorders like dementia, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's. But let's first start off with this new paper titled Sex Differences in Brown Adipose Tissue Activity and Cold-Induced Thermogenesis. So right out of the top, there was a mixed gender group. About 50% of the women, it was like 47% women and 53% men in the study. I think there was 53 some odd individuals in this particular study. And here's in short what they found, is that after undergoing some cold immersion, they used a PET way. This is a positron emission topography to actually look at how much of the brown adipose tissue is being activated after these individuals were sufficiently cold. Check this out. This is really interesting. The subclavicular fat and the characteristic depots of brown fat were active in 44% of the women, but only about 35% of men. So again, just to reiterate something here, women upon cold exposure statistically have higher induces in brown adipose tissue activation compared to men. So I think for a lot of people out there that say, you know what, women should not get cold on purpose for its purported health benefits, everything from decreasing chronic inflammation, again, possibly enhancing these cold shock proteins that degrade protein aggregates within the brain. There's the benefits that are linked with resting metabolic rate. I mean, the list goes on. We've talked about them before. Women can sufficiently induce their brown adipose tissue when they get cold, and statistically to a greater degree than men. And even more, though, that I think is quite interesting, if we continue on to go down to these tables, now we're looking at figure 4 here. I think this is quite interesting. And this is the cold-induced thermogenesis was not as activated during the luteal phase of menstruating women's cycle. So it goes to show that possibly progesterone or estrogen, the ratios there, do influence the ability of the brown adipose tissue to be activated upon cold exposure. So for some women, they might get more benefit of doing deliberate cold exposure maybe during the follicular phase of their cycle and maybe not doing so much during the luteal phase. It totally would depend upon how you personally feel and how cold exposure makes you feel. But I think it is important to recognize that there are hormonal influences here with regards to the cold-induced upregulation of brown adipose tissue activity. But as you can see here in both figure C, D, and E that is featured on the screen, you can see that the brown adipose tissue activation is actually higher during the follicular phase in women compared to men. And so again, what does that really mean? Remember, what is the brown adipose tissue? This is a specific subtype of fat that is inducible, that has metabolic protection, that essentially wastes cellular energy, which is good. Okay, so you want the mitochondria in your fat cells to waste energy. Dr. Ben Bikman, the author of Why We Get Sick, has talked about this extensively. You want your muscle tissues to be very coupled. You want the energy that your muscles are using to do work to directly convert to ATP. But you want the mitochondria in your fat tissue to be wasteful, to create heat, to essentially burn fuel. And so what the brown adipose tissue and its activity, what that does is that causes uncoupling within the mitochondria within your fat cells, which is good. That's what you want. So when you see here, particularly figure E, the brown adipose tissue activity is significantly increased, especially during the follicular phase of women's cycles compared to men in this particular study. And now you can see here there's, in figure D, there's a smaller increase in the cold-induced thermogenesis during the luteal phase compared to men, but the follicular phase there is certainly more. So we're going to continue on and talk a little bit more about this. But first, friends, I want to welcome you back. Thank you for being here. Thank you, as always, for hitting that like button. Thanks for subscribing. If you think this content is interesting, please leave a comment below and definitely share this with a friend who is curious about, cold immersion therapy, deliberate cold exposure. Should you go jump in a lake, river, stream, and so forth? We want to encourage people to challenge their body by way of hormetic stress or thermal stress. There's a lot of good data there, and we're going to really dive into these cold shock proteins. I know you've heard of heat shock proteins. The whole story about cold shock proteins is quite fascinating, but I do want to thank this show's sponsor, Skillshare.com, the leading online community where you can learn a range of different skills and tool sets to help develop yourself personally and on a business level. So if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a creative, if you're a business owner, you should definitely take advantage of the offer that Skillshare has offered for our community here at High Intensity Health by clicking the link below. The first 1,000 people can get a free trial access to Skillshare.com. The link will be below. One of the courses that I've been diving into a lot more lately as a communicator, I want to improve my ability to share stories with you, to communicate with you so that some of the studies that we talk about resonate more with you, is The Art of Storytelling and Communication by Jan Tren. And so this is a great course. There's over 6,000 people in this course that will help you to better communicate. We know that communication is key. And so the art of storytelling, stories are very captivating and they can help people remember things better. So definitely check out that course. I'm enrolled in that and I'm learning this right from my mobile phone, which is great. The app over at Skillshare is awesome. So again, the first 1,000 people that click the link below get a free trial membership. After that, it's very affordable, less than $11 a month. So definitely check it out. And thank you, Skillshare, for sponsoring this content. So I think, again, sort of in conclusion, it's really important to understand that what this study sought to investigate is whether or not brown adipose tissue activity is influenced by hormones. And it turns out that that indeed is the case. And in women, especially during the follicular phase, there is actually a significant increase in the activity of the cold-induced thermogenesis within the brown adipose tissue. So I think women who are menstruating that are concerned about whether or not there is added benefit from getting cold on purpose, well, this is just one study, but it did show that, yes, getting cold on purpose does in fact stimulate that metabolically protective brown fat in women. So that should be important, and I think enough evidence to get people to actually start to maybe take these small baby steps, like starting out with a cold shower. You don't have to invest in a $5,000, $10,000 Morozco forge. What you can do is start with a cold shower in the morning. Dr. Soberg and others have looked at about 7 minutes cumulative of deliberate cold exposure over the course of a week, okay? So again, it doesn't have to be this I'm gonna sit in this ice bath like Joe Rogan and shiver for 20 minutes. You can start out with a 30 to 40 second cold shower. You can call your friend and say, hey, let's go jump in the river this weekend. Let's go in the ocean. Let's go in this cold lake. Let's just do it just a little bit, because here's the thing, most people are just not doing this. And the data shows that ambient room temperature, if we live in this climate-controlled environment, we go from our air-conditioned home to the air-conditioned car to the air-conditioned grocery store or workplace, we are not challenging our thermal stress pathways. The heat shock proteins, and then as we're going to talk about very soon, the cold shock proteins. We need thermal stress on both ends of the spectrum. As we've talked about, it helps to cause your autonomic nervous system to be more resilient, raising heart rate variability, activating this sort of hibernating brown fat. We are born with this, but because our climates are so temperature controlled, our brown fat is not really activated. And so we need this periodic activation. So it turns out that women tend, especially during their follicular phase, it would be interesting to study post-menopausal women and men to see if there's any differences there. But I think this is quite interesting. But women, you have brown fat too, and you can activate it by getting cold on purpose. Now, let's just finish off with some very interesting sort of emerging research with regards to these cold shock proteins. Now, as we talked about, we've done, I think, 3 or 4 different videos talking about the HSP70, the heat shock protein 70. These are really intimately involved in some of the benefits that are linked with getting hot on purpose, i.e. going in a hot tub or a sauna, or doing hot yoga or exercise. Those activities do upregulate these heat shock proteins, and the heat shock proteins are involved in increasing nitric oxide synthase and causing the vasodilatory effects that are linked with the cardiovascular health benefits associated with regular and consistent sauna therapy, exercise, and hot tub therapy. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have these cold shock proteins. Who would have thought, right? You have the yin and yang here. And this paper, this was just recently published a few years ago, but it turns out that getting cold on purpose leads to a 200-fold increase in cold shock protein A, which is, so HSP is the acronym for the heat shock proteins. If you would like to continue to follow this emerging story about the physiology of cold shock proteins, the acronym that's used by scientific researchers in jargon is CSP-A, so for cold shock protein A. So within minutes of getting cold, these are inducible, they're upregulated. And it turns out that the cold shock protein targets and the binding proteins are actually connected to inflammatory hubs within the body. And so I think this is where, let's just say, take a step back and take a big picture overview of who should consider deliberate cold exposure. Individuals with autoimmunity, individuals with concerns and familial risk for neurocognitive or neurodegenerative diseases. We also know that anxiety, depression, mental health issues have an involvement with chronic low-grade inflammation. And so that's an individual that might want to consider getting cold on purpose, and also people with autoimmunity or history of cancer and or heart disease. Also, diabetes and metabolic diseases have some sort of characteristic chronic smoldering background inflammation. As we age, we get more inflamed as well. And another sort of mechanism, again, this is just speculative emerging research, we might know more about this in the next decade, about the nuances and the subtleties here about exactly how this works mechanistically. But these cold shock protein hubs, where they lie within the genome and sort of their metabolome, are connected to inflammatory hubs as well. We know that TNF-alpha, nuclear factor kappa beta, are these innate immune system byproducts and mediators that drive and perpetuate chronic inflammation. It turns out that these cold shock proteins help to antagonize those signaling hubs. So you might say, okay, well, why do I need to take a cold shower? Well, if you have high blood pressure, if you have sleep apnea, if you have allergies, if you have a little arthritis, you could benefit from decreasing that background noisy inflammation. And possibly one additional way to reduce the chronic smoldering inflammation, in addition to eating a better diet, in addition to exercise, in addition to mindfulness and stress reduction strategies, is getting cold, because mechanistically, these signaling hubs and these cold shock proteins help to reduce the inflammatory burden. So again, we don't have randomized human controlled studies to show that people who cold bath have lower, arthritic symptoms compared to people who don't, right? We don't have that yet, but who would have thought that there's these things called cold shock proteins that are inducible up to 200-fold increase above baseline when people get cold, studies have found. So again, there's a lot of data in bacteria, in rodents, but we don't have a lot of prospective studies in humans. But I think it's quite interesting. So I just wanted to share that story with you as we sort of finish off here and talk about the physiology of getting cold. But try to be consistent with this. If you think about exercise, you get the most benefits when you're training Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, or whatever, when you're consistent with this. If you kind of cold plunge willy-nilly, once a month, you don't acclimate. And that's where I think sort of the magic happens here, is when you're consistent and deliberate about this and you build up your tolerance. And by doing that, I think you're probably inducing and priming these pathways, whether it's mediated through the brown fat or mediated through the cold shock proteins. You're helping to sort of entrain these, whether it's a genetic target or a cellular or molecular pathway, you're inducing that. You're emphasizing that physiology. So try to be consistent. From a circadian rhythm perspective, I think it makes more sense based upon the diurnal rhythm in your core body temperature. It's lowest in the morning. So if you struggle with sleep, if you struggle with waking up energetic, you might want to try, in addition to getting early morning and morning sunlight and being very deliberate about that, getting cold in the morning, because your peripheral central clocks are influenced by the foods that you eat and the light that you're exposed to. So again, a lot of evidence here to suggest that this is a healthy habit and routine. The final comment that I will say is, if you work or live, I've had people reach out to me that say, hey, look, I work on fishing boats in Alaska. Like, do I really also need to get in an ice bath? If your occupation is such that you're regularly influenced and exposed to the cold elements, of course, you do not also need to get into an ice bath. But most people are not out working in cold environments, right? They're in a cozy condo or office building that is temperature controlled. So we need to understand, you also do not need to double down on this if you're regularly exposed to cold anyway. Most people are indoors, they're sedentary, climate controlled. We're trying to, create tools that are accessible for people living these sort of modern industrial lives, i.e. getting them cold on purpose with a cold shower or a plunge, so that they can experience some of those hormetic stressors. What do you think? How has cold immersions helped you in your life? I would love to know. Leave me a comment below, and your comments actually help a lot of other people when they watch these videos too. So thanks as always for watching all the way through. Thank you for hitting that like button. Thanks for subscribing, and we'll catch you on a future episode down the road. Bye now.